My name is Nina Hartwell, and I want you to understand something before I get into all of it. I didn't set out to disappear from my own life. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to go dark on my family, change my number, and move into a building so secure that even my own brother couldn't have found me with a private investigator and a prayer. But that's exactly what I did. And the reason, the real reason, started with a tiny red light blinking behind my bookshelf at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. Before I get to that, though, you have to understand how I got there. You have to understand how a person ends up discovering that their own mother has been watching them sleep. I grew up in a suburb of Phoenix, Arizona, in a house where privacy was something that happened in other families. My mother, and I say this having spent a long time in therapy trying to find words that are true without being cruel. My mother believed that the people she loved were extensions of herself, not separate people with their own inner lives and locked doors, but satellites, orbiting pieces of her, and anything that was hers, she was entitled to access, always, without asking. From the time I was about 12 until I left for college, my bedroom was less a room and more a checkpoint. She went through my backpack on a rotating schedule. She read my journal, not secretly, but openly, calmly, as if it were the most natural thing. Once, when I was 15, she printed out a conversation I'd had with a friend over email and showed it to my grandmother over dinner, laughing at something I had written in confidence. My grandmother laughed too. I sat there eating my mashed potatoes and felt something harden quietly inside me. Some small, protective layer my body was building around whatever was still private, still mine. My father was different, quieter, gentler, less likely to reach into my life uninvited. But he didn't stop her either, and I learned early that silence can be its own kind of permission. He passed away from a heart attack 3 years ago, sudden and shocking, and the kind of loss that rearranges every room in your chest. My mother's grief was enormous and real, I don't doubt that. But somewhere inside her grief, she also found a new reason, a new justification for the closeness she had always demanded. She needed us nearby now, she needed to know we were there. My brother, 2 years older than me, the version of our family story I was never cast in, moved his wife into a house 4 miles from hers. I moved to Austin. I took a software engineering job I had wanted for 2 years. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in South Austin, 3rd floor, decent natural light, a little balcony where I grew tomatoes that summer. I was 31 years old, making a real salary, paying my own bills, living my own life. I told myself the distance would help. I told myself the 11-hour drive between us was a kind of buffer that would finally create the space my childhood never gave me. What I did not account for was that my mother had no interest in buffers. The first time I came home to find her in my apartment, she was reorganizing my kitchen cabinets. Not waiting for me in the lobby, not sitting outside my door, inside. Standing at my open cabinets with a Tupperware container in one hand and an expression of serene concentration on her face, like she was arranging flowers at home. I had given her a key 6 months earlier, at her insistence. Just for emergencies, she had said. You're alone down there. What if something happens? I imagined emergencies the way a reasonable person imagines emergencies. A fire, a medical event, a locked-out situation. I did not imagine her driving 11 hours to rearrange where I kept my cereal. She told me my system didn't make sense. She said the glasses should be closer to the sink. She pulled everything off the second shelf and started over, and I stood in my own kitchen watching this happen and found, to my horror, that I couldn't make myself say the words. Not forcefully, not in the way that would actually stop her. I said things like, "You didn't have to do this," and "You could have texted before coming," and she responded to each one with a kind of cheerful dismissal that made me feel as though I were complaining about a gift. By the time she left, she had also wiped down my stovetop, moved my laundry detergent to what she considered a more logical shelf, and left a Pyrex dish of her chicken and rice in my fridge. She kissed my cheek at the door. I locked it behind her and stood in the dark hallway for a long time. I told myself it was a one-time thing. It wasn't. Over the next several months, she let herself in 3 more times while I was at work. I know because I started noticing the signs. A mug in the wrong spot. A book turned face down when I always keep them upright. The throw blanket on my couch folded in her particular way. A tight, neat rectangle instead of the loose drape I always leave it in. I confronted her each time. Each time, she had a reason. She was in the area. She wanted to drop something off. She was worried about the way I'd sounded on the phone last Thursday. I asked for the key back. She told me she didn't feel comfortable with that, given that I lived alone and anything could happen. I said I would change the locks if she wouldn't return it. She cried. And I, because I am the product of 31 years of training, apologized for saying I would change the locks. In my own apartment, I apologized for that. Then came my brother. I was in Dallas for a work weekend when I got a text from my mother on Friday evening saying she hoped I was having fun and that the apartment would be all set when I got back. I didn't understand what that meant. I found out Sunday night. The bathroom had product on the counter that wasn't mine. There was a used razor on the edge of the tub. The guest towel I kept folded over the rack had been used and draped differently. Someone had eaten at my kitchen table and left a grease ring from a to-go container directly on the wood. And in my bedroom closet, 2 of my cardigan sweaters had been pushed aside to make room for a hanging garment bag that held, I discovered, one of my sister-in-law's blazers. I called my mother. She told me my sister-in-law had needed a quiet place to work from for the weekend. My brother's home office was being repainted, and the house was chaos. She said it very casually, the way you might mention lending someone a cup of flour. I told her that was not acceptable, that she did not have my permission to offer my apartment to anyone, that I had not been consulted. She said she hadn't wanted to bother me while I was traveling. She said my sister-in-law had been very respectful and that I should be grateful the apartment was looked after while I was gone. I called my brother. He said he appreciated that it was my space, but the timing had been tough, and could I try to be understanding? He said it like I was the one making things difficult. I changed the locks the following week. I called the locksmith on my lunch break, came home, watched him replace the deadbolt, and held the 2 new keys in my hand like something precious. For a few weeks the quiet held. My apartment stayed exactly as I left it. I started breathing normally again in my own home, which is a thing I hadn't noticed I'd stopped doing. Then, on a Thursday evening in January, I came home from the gym to find my mother sitting on my couch. The TV was on. She had made tea. I stood in the doorway in my gym clothes and felt the room tilt slightly. She looked up and smiled. "You look flushed, honey. Were you running?" I had changed the locks. She did not have a key. I asked her how she had gotten in, and she explained, without any apparent awareness of how alarming this was, that she had called my property manager. She had told him she was in town for a surprise visit, that I hadn't been answering her calls, and that she was concerned I might be depressed or unwell. The property manager, a man I had no reason to distrust, had let her in for a welfare check. The full weight of what she had done took me a moment to absorb. She had called my landlord. She had told him I was potentially mentally unstable. She had used that to gain access to an apartment she no longer had a key to, and she was sitting on my couch with chamomile tea, perfectly at ease. I asked her to leave. She talked for 45 minutes before she did. I sent an email to the property manager that night. I CC'd the leasing office. I stated in writing that no one, not a family member, not a friend, not anyone describing a welfare concern, was authorized to enter my unit without my explicit written permission. I demanded documentation of what had happened. I was calm and thorough, and my hands were shaking the entire time I typed. But even then, somewhere beneath the anger, I felt something I didn't want to name. I felt the old familiar helplessness, the sense that she would always find a way, that I could change every lock, draft every email, have every difficult conversation, and she would simply locate the next gap, the next person she could charm or worry into compliance. She was not malicious in the way that word usually implies. She genuinely believed she had a right to access, that loving someone and having access to them were the same thing. It was my therapist who finally gave me language for it. I had been going to therapy for 8 months when I laid out the whole picture during one afternoon session: the key, my brother's visit, the landlord situation. When I finished, my therapist was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a classic enmeshment pattern. She doesn't experience you as a separate person. She experiences you as part of herself, and parts of yourself don't get to have locked doors." She said it so simply, like it was the obvious name for a thing I had been trying to describe in the dark for years. "You're not safe in your own home," she said, "not psychologically, and that matters." I drove home that day with the windows down even though it was 45 degrees outside because I needed the cold air on my face to stay present. I needed to feel something external while everything internal was rearranging itself. I did not fully decide what I would do until the camera. I had been working late at home on a Tuesday, laptop open on my coffee table, the lamp on the end table, the rest of the apartment dim. At some point, I got up to get water, and as I turned back toward the living room, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint red pulse, almost imperceptible, coming from the third shelf of my bookcase, between a row of paperbacks and a small succulent I'd had since college. I stood there for a moment. Then I walked over slowly, the way you approach something you're not sure you want to find. It was a small device, white, rounded, no bigger than a smoke detector, wedged sideways between two books, a tiny lens, a blinking red indicator light. A camera. I stepped back. My first coherent thought was that I didn't recognize it. My second thought was that, of course, I didn't recognize it because I hadn't put it there. And my third thought, arriving quietly, almost gently, like something I had known for a long time and was only just allowing myself to know, was that there was only one person with a history of entering this apartment uninvited. I didn't touch it. I took photographs with my phone instead, documenting its position, the angle of the lens, the shelf, the room. Then I called the non-emergency police line and filed a report. The officer who came was professional and thorough. She told me that installing a recording device in someone's residence without consent is a criminal offense in Texas. She bagged the device as evidence. She asked me who I believed had placed it there. I told her about my mother, about the key, about the landlord, about all of it. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has heard a lot of things and is still occasionally surprised. "Document everything from this point forward," she said. "Every entry, every contact, every incident." I told her I already had been. That night, lying in my apartment with every light on, I made a decision. It wasn't angry, it wasn't impulsive. It felt like something that had been slowly becoming inevitable for a very long time and had finally arrived. Not just change the locks, not just file another complaint, leave, move, disappear completely, cleanly, without giving anyone a forwarding address. And I wasn't going to tell my family. I found my new apartment the following week. A high-rise in the Muller neighborhood, the kind of building with a front desk staffed around the clock and key cards required to access every floor. The leasing agent showed me a unit on the 9th floor with big windows and exposed concrete ceilings. I signed the lease under my work email. I paid the deposit from an account my mother didn't know existed. I had opened it 2 years earlier for exactly this kind of contingency, though I hadn't known then what the contingency would look like. I told exactly 2 people, my coworkers Talia and Dion, who had been watching the situation develop for a year and responded to my confession with the specific seriousness of people who had been waiting to be useful. They came over on a Thursday night with boxes, wore dark hoodies without any prompting, and helped me pack in near silence, punctuated by occasional whispered commentary. Dion asked, at one point, whether we were moving an apartment or staging a crime scene. I told him the distinction felt philosophical. Talia laughed and wrapped another dish. We loaded everything into the moving truck under cover of dark. I swept my old apartment clean, every surface, every shelf. I left nothing behind that gave any information about where I was going. In the 2 weeks before the move, I had also updated my HR records to list a P.O. box, removed my address from every mailing list I could find, and asked the post office to hold my mail for pickup. I changed my phone number the morning of the move and sent the new number to 14 people, not including my mother or my brother. My last act before locking the old apartment door for the final time was to leave the old keys in an envelope in the building's outgoing mail slot, addressed to the property manager. No note, no explanation, no forwarding information. The first 3 days in my new apartment felt like a silence I hadn't known was possible. I slept with both windows open and no anxiety about footsteps in my hallway. I arranged my new kitchen exactly the way I wanted it and knew with absolute certainty it would stay that way. On the 4th morning, I turned my phone on. My brother had called 11 times. My mother had called 38 times. There were texts from numbers I didn't recognize, relatives she had apparently mobilized. And there was a post on my mother's Facebook that a cousin screenshotted and sent to my new number. Please pray for my daughter Nina. We cannot reach her and are very worried. It had 47 comments, mostly prayer hands emojis and concerned strangers. I put the phone face down and made coffee. Later, through a police report and a deeply mortified voicemail from my brother, I learned what happened on day 5. My mother had convinced my brother that something terrible had happened to me. In her telling, I had been unreachable for too long. The camera situation had clearly destabilized me. I might have done something rash. My brother, despite knowing better, allowed himself to be swept into her certainty the way he always did. Together, they drove to my old apartment complex. The woman who had just moved into my former unit opened her door to find 2 adults she had never seen in her life demanding to know where I was. My mother pushed against the door. My brother said things like, "We just need to look around, it'll only take a minute." The woman, whose name was on the lease now, not mine, immediately called 911. She told the dispatcher that strangers were attempting to force their way into her home. When the officers arrived, my mother was in the hallway, insisting her daughter lived there. My brother was trying to explain that this was a misunderstanding, while simultaneously preventing the officers from separating them, which was not improving matters. The new tenant was standing just inside her doorway with her phone out, recording everything. The officers separated my mother and brother, took statements, and ran the address. My name was no longer associated with the unit. Legally, they were 2 adults causing a disturbance at a private residence that had nothing to do with them. One of the officers found my prior contact information through a records search and called me. I was folding kitchen towels when my phone rang with an unknown number. I answered on instinct. "Is this Nina Hartwell?" "Yes." "This is Officer Dominguez with Austin PD. Are you currently safe?" The particular chill of those words, delivered in that order, is something I will not forget. "Yes," I said. "I'm safe. What happened?" He explained. I listened. When he finished, there was a silence in which I could hear myself breathing. "My family was attempting to enter a residence they have no connection to," I said finally, "because I moved." "That appears to be the situation," he said. "Your family is currently being asked to leave the property. There's also an open report in our system from a complaint you filed 6 weeks ago, a recording device." There it was. "Yes," I said, "that was me." He asked if I would come to the station to clarify the situation, given that my family had filed a missing persons inquiry that morning. I said yes. I also asked quietly whether the recording device investigation was still active. He confirmed it was. It had been assigned to a detective the previous week. I drove to the station with my hands steady on the wheel, which surprised me. I had expected to feel something chaotic. Instead, I felt a strange, clear calm, the kind that comes not from nothing being wrong, but from finally being on the right side of something. My mother was in the conference room when I arrived. My brother sat beside her. She saw me and burst into tears immediately, the specific tears I had watched for 32 years, the ones that arrived faster than grief has any right to arrive. "Nina," she said, reaching across the table, if you had answered me, none of this would have happened." "I moved," I said. I sat down across from them and set my bag on the chair beside me. "I moved to a new apartment and didn't give you the address. That's not a crisis. That's a decision." "You disappeared," my brother said. "I relocated," I said, "without notifying you, which I'm legally permitted to do." Officer Dominguez stood near the wall. He cleared his throat. "Ms. Hartwell is correct. An adult choosing to change their residence and withhold their address from family members is not a legal matter. Attempting to enter a private residence that is no longer associated with that adult, however, is a matter we take seriously." My mother looked at him, then back at me. Her tears had stopped with the efficiency of a turned faucet. "I was scared," she said. "I thought something had happened to you." "I know," I said, "and I understand that. But something did happen to me, Mom. You put a camera in my apartment. You accessed my home repeatedly without permission. You told my landlord I was mentally unwell so he would let you inside. Those things happened, and we are going to talk about them today." My brother started to say something. I looked at him, and whatever was in my expression stopped him. He had known me for 34 years. He knew when I was finished accommodating. I laid out 3 things. My voice did not waver. First, no one in my family would have my new address. Not now, and not unless I chose to share it at some point in the future. Second, all contact would go through my phone, on a schedule I determined. Unexpected visits to any location associated with me were finished. Third, my mother would not contact my employer, my landlord, my neighbors, or any third party regarding my whereabouts, my well-being, or my character. If she had a concern about me, she would call me directly. If I didn't answer immediately, she would wait. "And if any of this is violated," I said, "I will limit contact entirely. That's not a threat, it's information." My mother sat across from me, looking like she was trying to understand a language she'd never had to learn before. My brother rubbed the back of his neck and stared at the table. "You've changed," my mother said finally. Her voice was small. "Yes," I said, "I have." There was no document signed that day, no formal agreement. I had no illusion that paperwork alone would change 30 years of pattern. What I had instead was something I had never had before in a room with my family, a complete absence of guilt. I wasn't performing calm. I wasn't managing my reactions to protect her feelings. I was simply there, steady, saying true things in plain language, and waiting. The recording device investigation concluded 4 months later. The DA ultimately declined to prosecute, citing no prior criminal record and mitigating circumstances. But my mother was formally cautioned. She attended a session with a family court mediator. My brother, who had not known about the camera, went very quiet when he found out. He called me 2 days later, the longest phone call we'd had in years. He didn't apologize exactly, but he said, I didn't know how bad it had gotten. And then, after a pause, I should have paid more attention. That was enough. I didn't need more than that. 14 months on, I wake up in my 9th-floor apartment with its concrete ceilings and its key cards and its front desk staff who know my name and my face and no one else's. I do yoga on the balcony before the city fully wakes up. I keep my bookshelf exactly the way I want it, paperbacks on the left, hardcovers on the right, one small succulent in the corner. No blinking lights, no hidden lenses, just books and morning light and quiet. My mother and I talk on the phone on Sunday evenings for about 20 minutes. She does not ask for my address. Some Sundays she tests the edges. A comment about wishing she could just stop by, a mention of how much easier things would be if she knew the neighborhood. I say, "I'll meet you for lunch next time you're in Austin," and I mean it, and she knows I mean it, and that is the shape our relationship has taken now. Adjusted, imperfect, but chosen, on both sides, which is something it never was before. My brother and his wife come down about twice a year. We get barbecue. Last time, he brought me a plant. A small succulent in a terracotta pot. He'd noticed the one on my shelf, or remembered something I'd mentioned once, or maybe both. We didn't talk about any of the hard things directly that afternoon, but he set the plant on the table between our plates like a small, quiet offering, and I took it home and put it next to the other one on my shelf. I used to think that setting limits with family meant you had stopped loving them, that the locked door was a rejection. I don't think that anymore. The locked door is the reason I can still open it sometimes and mean it when I do. The distance is the reason a Sunday phone call can feel like something I actually want rather than something I'm surviving. You can love someone all the way through and still not give them your address. That's not a contradiction. That's just the truth of how some relationships have to be held. Carefully, with both hands, at exactly the right distance. My keycard is in my pocket right now. Black, matte, the size of a credit card. Every morning when I leave and every evening when I return, I tap it against the panel by the elevator and watch the light turn green. No one gets in unless I let them, and for the first time in my life, that is simply, quietly, mine.